Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
So the road to Wiseman's Ferry is familiar, but I've never felt the way I do this time, that the hour's drive from Sydney is a journey backwards into deep time. You start in the densely packed houses of the city. They gradually thin out into the leafy, spread out suburbs in the north, and they thin out in turn into lifestyle blocks with horses, and bit by bit they thin out into market gardens and nurseries. All the while, the road is rising. Finally, there are no more houses, no more farms, just a high plateau of dry bush. That's been there, growing and dying, over and over, for endless stretches of the past.
Kate Grenville is one of Australia's most celebrated writers. Her international bestseller, The Secret River, is now a much-loved Australian classic. Her novels include Sarah Thornhill, The Lieutenant, the Orange Prize winner The Idea of Perfection, A Room Made of Leaves, and Restless Dolly Maunder, which shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Her works of non-fiction include One Life, My Mother's Story, The Case Against Fragrance, and Elizabeth MacArthur's Letters. Today I'm talking to Kate Grenville about her new book, Unsettled, A Journey Through Time and Place. Kate Grenville, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Unsettled begins like a memoir, but soon reveals itself as a journey, as your subtitle suggests, through time and place, a journey which begins at Ball's Head on Sydney Harbour. What is significant for you about Ball's Head?
Ball's Head is near the place where I went to school, North Sydney Demonstration School, and one of my most vivid early memories is of being walked down there from the school with the class when I was about 10, to look at an Aboriginal rock engraving there. Now, I had a vivid memory. I could have drawn it molecule by molecule, I thought, but for some reason, a year or so ago, it just occurred to me that I wanted to go there and look at it again. And I went there and I realised that my memory had completely distorted what was actually there. I had remembered a place of very natural beauty, the bush, the wind, the harbour down there, and this rock engraving, which at that point was behind a white council fence and was picked out in white Dulux. What I had completely erased from that picture was all that had grown up around that engraving in the time since I saw it as a child, namely a huge, I think it's a coal loader. It's an enormous, ugly industrial building right hard up against that beautiful engraving. And it struck me that I had erased, in a way, this looks like a kind of metaphor really, I had erased the damage that what you call my lot, non-Indigenous Australians, had done. I had idealised this place and erased the damage that we had done when we moved in. And that was somehow the focus of thoughts that I'd been actually having for 20, 25 years. I've actually been writing this book for that long. There are bits in this book which are notes that I would have taken back in the year 2000. And somehow the powerful emotional impact of seeing that engraving again and realising how wrong my memory was suddenly brought everything together into focus. It was an amazing moment. And I thought, this is a journey that I have to take through my family history. At that point, it wasn't a book. It was just a personal journey.
Unsettled is also a family story, a story which begins with a drive to Wiseman's Ferry and some very personal reflections on the way. The road to Wiseman's Ferry is familiar, you write, but I've never felt the way I do this time. There's something hypnotic about those mighty cliffs, a landscape that's not on a human scale. This time, that landscape seems to have affected you in a very profound way.
That's right. I've been going to Wiseman's Ferry. Well, I probably first went there when I was about 12 with my mother, who wanted to show me the place where my great-great-grandfather had built a house, which is now the Wiseman's Ferry Inn. And he'd started the ferry, which, he called after himself. So she wasn't necessarily proud of that history, but she wanted to pass it on. It was the legacy We didn't have lace christening robes and all that kind of thing, but we did have these stories. So I heard it, but I wasn't that interested. Something in me really resisted that whole notion that we had been there for that long. But in the year 2000, I started to think, I did the reconciliation walk across the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And that again was a kind of focus point. And I suddenly thought, I actually want to find out what that great-great-great-grandfather of mine and the other generations between 1806, which is when he was sent out, he was a convict, between 1806 and the present. I'm actually ready now to combine my family story with the big national story of our history, 200 years of history. So I went to Wiseman's Ferry in about 2000, nosing around the idea of using that great-great-great-grandfather of mine as the sort of starting point, the inspiration for a novel that would really take him as a representative convict settler and use his story to tell a much bigger story of, what happened in general on the frontier at that point. So I went there in 2000, and I then, in the course of researching the book that became The Secret River, I went there many times. I would spend whole days just mooching around, doing a bit of sketching, taking a few photos, digging stuff up out of the ground and thinking it was significant. But when I went back just a year ago, 18 months ago, I saw it very differently. And I realised then how much I had missed out in understanding the Aboriginal life that had been there. I hadn't allowed myself to understand the sort of physical reality of the fact that Aboriginal people really had lived there and grown their crop of root vegetables, medini. But in 2024, I did go there, and it pierced me like an arrow to realise just how intensely that ground had been used by Darug and Darkinjung people. And also, perhaps more importantly, a kind of meta realisation that I had pretty much pushed that to one side all those years. Here I am, 74, and I'm just for the first time really understanding as a kind of emotional reality what had happened back then.
There's a palpable and ever-increasing feeling of discomfort as your journey continues, up along Settlers Road to St Albans, through the Hunter Valley, to Gunnedah and the Western Plains, to Guyra and the Northern Tablelands. As I read, I didn't feel a sense of an easing of that discomfort. What did you find in these places?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I set off without any particular intention. I set off feeling unsettled because it was very soon after the Voice referendum, and I was very disappointed that that was defeated so conclusively, and it made me think about all sorts of things again. So I set off in a amusing frame of mind. I framed it to myself as a pilgrimage at one point, although later I began to think that that was probably not a good word for it. I didn't tell anybody what I was doing because I didn't want to cut off any options by trying to clarify too quickly what I was doing. Totally open-ended, a sort of meditative thing. So it wasn't that I was looking for that unsettled feeling to go away. And the unsettled feeling, of course, was a feeling of kind of unfinished business about our history. When I stood at Wiseman's Ferry, I could say, this is the exact spot that my great-great-grandfather stole. Let's call a spade. He stole from the Darug. And that reality leads to unanswerable questions. Okay, he stole it. Well, I didn't do it. Should I feel guilty? I can't give it back. I can't go back to London, where he came from. What can I do? It's a kind of stalemate, a kind of circular thought. And then it's easier to just stop thinking about it because there is no real answer to that question. We're on, land that was taken from someone else. What do we do about it? And what do we do now that we know about how it was taken? So I set off in this very open-ended frame of mind, and my unsettled feeling actually increased in many places, particularly when I saw the place that the next generation had settled in, up near, not far from Tamworth. That took me all the way through to the end of the family stories. And at that point, I will probably get to this, but at that point I thought, okay, let's take a sideways leap here. And I decided to go to the memorial that's been built to one of the most famous and egregious massacres that took place, the Mile Creek Massacre. And the book ends there, even though that place has nothing to do with my family story. But even now, what I feel is that I have opened a door to further thinking about it, really, having lived for a fair while with a door that was well and truly ajar, but not fully open.
Let's talk about the Mile Creek Massacre because that is an important moment in Australian history. As I understand it, the first and last time that white men were hanged for the massacre of Aboriginal people. As I read that chapter, it was coloured by this mixture of grief and remorse, but strangely enough, also of hope. Where did you find the hope in that story?
Yes, the Mile Creek Massacre Memorial is an extraordinary place. Well, the massacre was done in 1838, and it was a premeditated massacre by a group of stockmen out on a very remote station then. They sent the young Aboriginal men away to cut bark, and then they rounded up the women, children, and old men, put them in a hut, tied them up, force marched them to a nearby hillside, and killed them all with swords and with guns. And they then lit a bonfire to try and dispose of the evidence. It happened all over Australia for many, many years, similar things. There were, I think from memory, 30 or 40 people killed in cold blood. It was not unique in what happened, but it was unique in the sense that one of the people who witnessed it went to a magistrate and told him about it. And most unusually, it was followed up. And as you said, seven white men were hanged against a huge public outcry, people who didn't think that, that they should be punished. The remarkable thing about the memorial is that ever since 1838, the descendants of a few survivors and the descendants of the perpetrators have lived together in a little tiny town called Bingara. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Sometime around the year 2000, those two groups of people came together over somebody's kitchen table, is how I've been told, and said, look, we're living here together, and here's this awful, dark, horrible thing that we're kind of not looking at and not talking about. Let's sit down, talk about it, get it out in the open, let the light shine on it, and work out what we can do together as Indigenous and non-Indigenous to honour the people who were killed and memorialise what happened as, the way they put it on the plaque at the memorial, as an act of reconciliation. Now that gives me hope, because the worst thing is when something terrible has happened in the past and you know about it but you refuse to look at it. That's where a lot of anger and kind of inchoate fury and nastiness comes from. When you get those bad things out into the light, look at them and talk about them frankly, you realise a couple of things. You realise, first of all, you were probably frightened to do that, worried that you would be overwhelmed by those feelings of shame and horror. But also, actually, you're not overwhelmed. There's something immensely clarifying about bringing the stuff out and talking about it. That's why the Mile Creek Memorial offers such hope. It is possible to get those things out and start talking about them together and moving forward together. I finished writing this book about a year ago, and I suppose that's what I hope this book might achieve, something a little bit similar.
As significant as that memorial may be, it has been subject to vandalism in the past, and it makes me wonder what kind of feeling a person might harbour that drives them to commit such an act.
It is incredible, along with the brass plaques there, which tell you what happened on that day and various other things. There's another brass plaque that says that someone came and actually chiselled. The things are made of bronze. They're pretty tough. Would have had to bring an angle grinder, I think. And they chiselled off the most significant words in the memorial. Women, children, and murdered, I think, were the words they chose to chisel off, or probably angle grind off. I thought a lot about that, and I thought, again, it comes back to that thing of not being prepared to look at something. And so that suppressed feeling, a bit like when a wound appears to heal, the skin closes over, but underneath, it's infected. And that doesn't go away until you open it up. So I think that extraordinary vandalism, and, many Aboriginal memorials are vandalised on a regular basis. And it is, I think, an expression of that kind of hidden infection.
Let's talk about the tools of every author: language, words. In your revisit to Wiseman's Ferry, you say this right here is the actual specific bit of land that he took up, meaning your great-great-great-grandfather. I hope I've got the right number of greats. You call the term took up a weasel word of a phrase. What do you mean by weasel word?
Thank you, Don Watson, for coining that fabulous phrase. Look, if you said Solomon Wiseman, that's the name of my ancestor, took that bit of riverside land, you would know that something bad had happened. The word took implies, grabbing something, perhaps that doesn't belong to you, and certainly not asking anybody's permission. But as soon as you add that little word up to it, he took up land, then suddenly you're in another realm. You're in the realm of people taking up a suggestion or taking up a bit of unfinished knitting. It's a quite different feeling, and it somehow lets you off the hook. It is no longer a bad thing. It almost has an inevitability, and it almost has a positive spin on it. You're sort of taking something that's been neglected or ignored, and you're doing what should be done with it. It's a really very nice thing to have done. The family story always talked about the land having been taken up by Solomon Wiseman, and many, many, many accounts of our past use that same phrase, took up. And it alerted me to the fact, I think that was the moment at which this book started to become about language as much as about the events that took place. In fact, for many drafts, I've wrote an insane number of drafts of this book, something like, 30 or 40. It evolved over those 20 years of note-taking. But for many years, the draft was called The Stories We Tell. And it was specifically about not the content of the stories, but how we tell them, to kind of let ourselves off the hook, as in the case of Took Up. So almost every page in this book has a moment of me saying, that's a funny word to use, or I wonder what that really means. I wonder why they used that word rather than the other word, which personally as a reader, but also as a writer, I find it fascinating how we can manipulate language in the most subtle ways to point people in the direction we want them to go, or else like a magician, kind of, patter to take their eyes off what is actually happening.
Let's talk about a few of those words: took up or taken up, pioneers, heritage. They all sound very romantic terms. An interesting one, the hooey over a piece of land, and even the much used word reconciliation, even in the title of this book, Unsettled, and its inverse, settled. Is it time to do away with these euphemisms? But how do you do that with terms that are so entrenched in our culture and our language?
I think the thing is to bring them to consciousness. We use language as if it's sort of transparent, as if it doesn't have a kind of force of itself. I think we need to get a bit sensitised and realise that the words we use, even quite innocent sounding ones, are actually shifting the dial on what we are feeling about what we're describing, if that makes sense. I mean, we see it every day in the news, in the papers. I read The Guardian every morning. I look at how the journalists have chosen, the word backflip, for example, that's an extremely negative word. All it means is that a politician has learned some new information and has changed their mind. As citizens, basically, as members of this community of Australia, we owe it to ourselves to be more conscious of how the language is directing us to think in a certain way.
Another word that you introduced to this story, you bring up the idea of non-Indigenous Australians, which has a certain ring to it, but you propose an alternative term, Ballanda. Tell me about that word and how it relates to non-Indigenous Australians.
Yeah, well, look, as you have just demonstrated, the phrase non-Indigenous Australians is quite a mouthful. It's very awkward to say. So at about the 2/3 point in the book, I take this is a book full of digressions. One of the many digressions was about what we're called, we non-Indigenous Australians. And I went through all the different things that we might be called, white fella. Well, first of all, many non-Indigenous Australians are not white, but also it's kind of slightly hitchhiking on the term blackfella, as if to make us equivalent, when of course we're not. Blackfella and whitefella have different life experiences, different life histories, have brought them to very different places, and it's much more than the colour of our skin. What else? Settlers and colonists. Well, that kind of leapfrogs over the bit that happened just before the settling or the colonising, the bad bit where we kind of took the land. So it's kind of an evasion of that, a leapfrogging over the truth to call ourselves settlers or colonists. Invaders were certainly true of the first generation, but it's not true, say, of my generation. That doesn't quite work anyway. And in any case, it gets people's backs up. And if you want to actually, progress a conversation, there's probably not a lot of point in getting people's backs up. It was one of the things I worked at very hard in this book to try and not trigger people's instant responses to what is a very controversial subject. Then I thought about New Zealand. Now, in New Zealand, they have a word called pakaha, which is how they describe non-Indigenous New Zealanders. Now, there is a real mouthful of words. Most non-Indigenous New Zealanders are quite happy to be called pakaha, even though some are not. The word appears to come, they're not quite sure where the word comes from, but it could come from the word porker, the English word porker, meaning pig, because the early sealers used to leave pigs on the islands so that when they came back the following year, the pigs would have multiplied and they've got some nice stuff to eat. Maori people took over this word porker, made it part of their own language by changing it, pakaha, porker to pakaha. They then used it to describe non-Indigenous New Zealanders. Now, that seemed to me a fabulous thing because it acknowledges that the non-Indigenous New Zealanders are foreigners in the very language of the Maori people. In Australia, that's tricky because there are many different Aboriginal languages, and if you use the word for white person in one of those languages, then you're ignoring and displacing all the others. So that doesn't quite work. But up in the northern part of Australia, for centuries before the British came here, but people from some of the islands, which are now called Indonesia, used to visit. They were after a sea slug in the sea. And they themselves were colonised by the Dutch, who called themselves Hollanders. So the Indonesian, or Macassans, called those colonisers Balanda. They had absorbed the word Hollander and made it their own. And up in the northern, this is a very long way of getting to the point that in the northern part of Australia, many Aboriginal people call white people Balanda. Now that seems to me to have all the advantages of pakaha. It's actually a word, it's actually originally a Dutch word, if you like, that has been incorporated into the Aboriginal language and turned back on us. It's also easy to say, and because it's a borrowing, it doesn't leave out any Aboriginal languages. So look, I see all the problems with Balanda, and I'm sure that my fellow non-Indigenous Australians won't want to take it on. But I used it in the book from then on. The phrase non-Indigenous Australian has a real problem about it. It's not just hard to say, but it leaves out an important reality, which is that it implies that we are the default from which all other groups sort of err or deviate. And that's very wrong. I don't think we should feel ourselves as being the kind of default from which everybody else is an aberration. We need a name for ourselves as a group that identifies us, just as we have done that to other groups. It's not a neutral thing, non-Indigenous Australian. That's why I started to look around for alternatives.
The referendum on the voice to Parliament brought many of these issues into focus, but given the result, one conclusion to draw is that it's now in the rearview mirror. Where does that defeat leave us as a nation?
Look, the referendum was just one moment in a very, very long struggle by Aboriginal people for justice, basically. It was one moment. And yes, it was roundly defeated. I think not because Australians, by and large, are racist. I think it's because our history makes us very, very uncomfortable and we'd rather not think about it, which is, where my book started. I mean, even that slogan, if you don't know, vote no, it sort of says, look, it's okay to go on not thinking about it. So that was lost and that's in the past, but I think it churned up a lot of dust and that dust is still hovering in the air. I think it made a lot of people start to, even if they were hostile and voted no, they had to think about the issues, at least to some extent. I handed out how to vote cards for the pre-polling. Really, really interesting. I didn't hear much overt racism, but I did hear a lot of kind of bewilderment and a feeling that it was kind of all too hard. I think people have been left with that feeling, but they haven't put those issues right back in the cupboard. They've put them back in the cupboard a bit, but they are still stirred around. The referendum was a defeat, but it opened discussion, even when that discussion was often a bit toxic. People started to talk about an issue which hasn't been sufficiently talked about. It's been put on the agenda. We probably won't ever revisit that particular voice idea, or perhaps not in quite that form, but it gives us a way to revisit the whole question of how we move forward kind of honourably as non-Indigenous Australians on this place that we took from First Nations.
All of this leads me to the idea of treaty, which may or may not be the next step in this process. I was talking to Melissa Lukashenko recently, the author of Eden Glassy. She seemed to suggest we're going to have a treaty sooner or later. They're the kind of large-scale outcomes that we might seek. Will treaty help, particularly if we look at it through the prism of what's happening in New Zealand recently, where the premise of that treaty is being questioned?
I started to think about treaty, in fact, because of Melissa Lukashenko. She was kind enough to read this book. And at the end of it, she said, look, it's fine, but, you should be talking more about treaty. And I thought, oh, that's too complicated for me. I don't understand that. I can't get involved with those big kind of political ideas. But as like a lot of things that Melissa has said to me over the years, it kind of stuck in me like a splinter. And I went on thinking about it to the point of going and doing some research about what treaties are all about. And I discovered a thing that in my ignorance I had no idea about. To have a treaty just means an agreement. You don't have to be at war to have a treaty. A peace treaty is only one kind of treaty. So that was a bit of an eye-opener for me. The other thing is that talking to Henry Reynolds, a very distinguished historian who's done a huge amount of work on these things, what he said to me was, even if a treaty is incomplete or unfair or ignored, it gives you a place to start further negotiations. If you don't have a treaty, if you don't have any kind of agreement, you're just floundering in the dark. You don't know where to start. And I was entirely convinced by both Melissa and Henry. I think whatever you call it, and treaty may be the wrong word, it might be a misleading kind of word, whatever you call it, I think we do need, non-Indigenous Australia needs to sit down and work out some kind of agreement with Indigenous Australia, because we never have. We are virtually, I think, the only colony that the British established where they didn't have a treaty. When they invaded the US and Canada, they had a whole series of treaties with different First Nations. We are one of the very few that didn't have anything at all. We knew people lived here, or let's say, Captain Cook and Phillip knew that people lived here, but they just kind of came in and pretended that that wasn't so. And we've never put that right, which means that when you start to think about how can we find justice, with the fact that we've taken an entire continent from the people it belonged to, there is kind of nowhere to start. Whereas if you sit down and nut out some kind of agreement, no matter how kind of inadequate, it gives you a place to start talking.
What worries me about books like Unsettled is that they reach the audiences that already understand. But how do we change minds, the minds of those who stubbornly refuse to recognise the history and also the scale of the problem?
Yeah, really good question. Look, one of the reasons Unsettled is the kind of book it is, which is very personal, sort of improvised, it's a ramble, it does not lecture, it does not give a history lesson, it does not get hot under the collar about things. One of the reasons I did that was that I very much want people to read it. So I'm thinking it's a very accessible book. In fact, it will no doubt be accused of being kind of lightweight. I'd rather it be that, because I want people to read it. And what I'd like them to do when they've read it, as I hope they do, I mean, there are even a few fleeting bits of humour. At least I think they're slightly humorous.
I think so too, Kate.
Oh, thank you, good. So it was very important for me to kind of step around. Modern life is even more polarized than it used to be. People take up positions and stick to them, and that's how it is. So if you want to kind of undo some of that, you have to step around it. I think of it as getting in under the radar. Just avoid the whole idea of having an argument. Do something else. So I've kind of gone sideways, and that's why the book it's a ramble of digressions with no particular beginning or end, in a way. What I would like people to take away from the book is the feeling that it is possible to think about these subjects, stalemates notwithstanding. It is possible to start thinking about it, and each kind of non-Indigenous Australian might have their own way of doing what I did. I did a kind of journey into the question, really, how am I here? To try and solve the question of how to be here in an honourable or honest way on somebody else's land. Everybody will have their own way of doing that. I felt that I had a fabulously rich field to explore because my family goes back for those 4 generations, and I have family stories about each of those generations. I know where each of those things happened. That gives me one particular way of answering that question, how to be here. Somebody who arrived yesterday will have a very different way of thinking, well, okay, I'm here now. How can I think truthfully about how to be here?
Kate Grenville, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you very much.
I've been talking to Kate Grenville about her new book, Unsettled, A Journey Through Time and Place. It's published by Black Ink, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.